This morning, we have some interesting papers and presentations, and our keynote this morning is going to be Dr. Joel Mozer, who is the Chief Scientist, Air Force Space Command. Dr. Mozer is stationed at Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado. He's got more than 30 years of experience in space science, engineering, management, working on space and ground systems for the Department of Defense. He has a lot of background in AFRL's Space Weather Division, and has been a forward thinker and futurist within the Air Force, thinking about what the changes in the space industry and the globalization of space exploration that we've seen over the past several years really means for strategic thinking, not only in terms of economics, but military defense and security. And I'm really looking forward to hearing his thoughts about how what the Air Force is doing and is thinking about our next several decades in space might help lay the groundwork for a more secure future that leads to interstellar exploration. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Dr. Mozer.
Well, thank you, Les. This is a pleasure to be here. Normally when I give talks to the Department of Defense or Air Force, I have to drag them kicking and screaming into the future. They're typically worried about the problems that face them today right up in front of their face. So thinking about the future is tough. I don't think that's going to be a problem with this crowd. Matter of fact, my future may seem a little bit near term and pedestrian to you guys, but I think it will actually provide a different perspective than you're used to seeing. I really want to talk about the future of space from the perspective of what does it mean to national power, U.S. national power, and I'll talk a little bit about that, and hopefully it'll give you a different thought, a different set of things to think about. Grab my piece here. So first of all, talking about space power, there's a couple of great quotes out there about what the future is, what we need to think about. Great power is really an issue that comes to mind when you're talking about national leadership, national governance. And by that I don't mean to say dominance. I'm not talking about dominance in space. I'm talking about what does it mean for a nation to be a great power. And I like these quotes. A great power is the ability to influence actions at a great distance. That's what a great power is. A superpower is a state with a dominant position characterized by its extensive ability to influence, project power on a global scale and beyond. So that's really where the United States today sits on the global stage. And the question is, what happens as we expand into space? What becomes of this great power advantage or this superpower advantage we have? What aspects of that really come to play when we talk about our military, our civil, and our commercial expansion into space? And that's really what I want to talk to you about. But first I want to talk about a little bit about grand strategy. Grand strategy is a concept we don't hear a lot about. Presidential candidates don't campaign on it. It's not really talked about in Congress. There's not a document in the National Archives labeled U.S. Grand Strategy. To really understand grand strategy, you have to look back in history and see what it is that this nation's done and how it's reacted to certain things in history. And that's basically where grand strategy comes from. And it's been amazingly consistent since the end of World War I. And there's really four pillars of U.S. grand strategy that have been consistent since before the Cold War ever started. One is to be militarily superior, to have the capabilities and the ability to control the fight anywhere on the globe. That's kind of a fundamental pillar of U.S. grand strategy. Also, to reassure and support our allies, to come to their defense when our allies need it. The U.S. will be there. We also have civil and commercial elements of our grand strategy, in particular to incorporate other allies and nations into our markets and processes, to open up our commercial abilities to the world. And finally, our grand strategy is to inhibit the spread of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction, kind of obvious. But note that each of these pillars really would extend seamlessly into space. And that's where I'm coming from. That's what I would like to talk about. Anything that the nation does should start from our grand strategy, from our ethos, from the culture that we've developed. And our national defense strategy is one of those things. And in 2018, the national defense strategy came out with 3 tenets. For the first time in history, we have these 3 things coming together. The first is a return to great power competition. That's not new. We've done that in the past. We also have the rapid increasing rate of change of technology. This is a new thing. And the fact that the technology that we have is globally accessible, that our adversaries and allies have almost equal access to our technology as do we. And this is a big change for us. We're used to being the technologically superior component in any strategic engagement. So one thing to say about that is the rate of change of technology is really pushing us to space, as you guys are well aware. Our presence in space is increasing. We're commercializing space. Space is growing very quickly because of the reduced launch costs, the increasing capability of microelectronics that can be launched in a single satellite. We expect that there will be an increased human presence in space with a push beyond Earth into the moon, Mars, and beyond, into interstellar space. And these things are really what's driving our need to expand. I, along with a lot of my colleagues, believe that we are standing on the precipice of the next great space race. You know, I've been believing that since I was 8 years old, but I think we're about there. And just yesterday, Elon Musk launched another 60 of his Starlink satellites. You know, this is incredible. 2 weeks ago, he hadn't even built all of those satellites. They were delivered to the Cape and launched. These things are printed out at a much lower than $1 million cost, and they're going to provide great capability. You know, they've filed for as many as 30,000 of these internet service providing satellites in low Earth orbit. I think it's only a matter of years before we're able to walk from satellite to satellite in low Earth orbit. But that's where we are today. And so let me talk about what we did. So about 10 months ago at the U.S. Air Force Academy, my colleagues and I convened a workshop called the Space Futures Workshop. We had folks from the Department of Defense, from NASA, from industry, and various other places. And our goal was to say, okay, with all of these 3 elements of great power competition that exists today and with a rapidly expanding space, what does this really mean? How do we couch the future in terms of the impacts on space futures, on the national power in the future of space? And so we looked at 3 different axes, 3 different elements that may or may not be orthogonal, they may not be independent, but we treated them as such in this work. The first was life in space. What does it mean to expand human presence in space? Today there are 6 people that work and live in space. They're on the International Space Station. A lot of people talk about hundreds or thousands of people in space in the next few decades. So we wanted to explore that. Then there's the commercialization, the money in space. What does it mean to have expanding commercialization in the expanded space? If this future next space race is to really survive and be sustainable, it's going to require that there are new revenue streams in space, that there are people that can make money out there, that entrepreneurs will expand and do new things in space. And that's the axis we wanted to look at with that. And then finally, who's the leadership? Who is going to lead that expanded space future? Is it going to be the United States? Is it going to be one of our allies, another country, one of our strategic competitors? Is it going to be industry? Is it going to be Amazon that leads the expansion of space? And again, what does that mean for U.S. national power on the global stage in the future? So I also want to point out, notice the icons there, the person, the dollars, and the star. I'll refer to those in the future to keep you oriented. So let's talk about that first one, the human presence. And what we wanted to do is to put bounds on the extremes, positive and negative aspects of each of these axes. And by the way, we set our sights on the year 2060, which again is a very long distance for, it's a far out horizon for the U.S. Department of Defense to even be thinking about. It's not something we normally do. So for the case of human presence, again, like I said, today we have 6 people that live and work in low Earth orbit. That's kind of our extent. For 2060, we set the lower bound basically at that. We said that human presence has advanced marginally beyond the level achieved by the space station, primarily driven by exploration and research, and maybe a small amount of tourism for the well-heeled. Most space functions are controlled remotely as they are today, or robotically using autonomous and artificial intelligence systems. And humans have returned to the moon and landed on Mars, but there's no permanent presence there. So basically we made it back, planted another flag, and said, okay, we've made it. So that's the lower bound of the human presence axis. The upper bound is much more expansive. Thousands from many nations live and work in LEO, cislunar, moon, Mars, interstellar space, what I'd add to that. That increased human presence in space supports not only military but civil and commercial needs. Manned bases on the moon supporting science or the economy, manned habitats across cislunar space support the logistics, manufacturing, tourism, and resource extraction, and habitats in space, moon and Mars constructed and maintained using extraterrestrial resources. So this is kind of the upper bound in the next 50 years, 40, 50 years that we looked at to describe what the human presence would be. What about the commercial presence? We really, looked at today's trends. And by the way, there was a lot of trend analysis based on NATO. NATO does quite a bit of work in strategic foresighting. So they, every couple of years, will look across the globe and snap the chalk line on political, social, technical, economic, and environmental factors and what their trends are. And they'll try to extrapolate in the future. And that was sort of the basis of all of our bounds. So for commercial potential, we asked the question, what's the economic level of this new space future? And the lower bound is basically an extrapolation of what we're doing today, advanced marginally beyond the current state. So you hear folks, for example, Wilbur Ross, the Department of Commerce, projects that the global value of the space economy will be something like $3 trillion in the next 10 years, which is a considerable increase, given that we're about $300 billion space global domestic product right now. But finally, the space economy is primarily stuck in LEO, GEO, or MEO, and principally supports terrestrial needs as it does today. Communications, positioning, navigation, timing, such as from your GPS, other information gathering services. So that's the lower bound. The upper bound is that we have an expanding space global product, expanding to about 10% of our GDP. That not only do we provide those information services that I talked about, we also provide power, manufacturing, resource extraction, and tourism, new things. Major industrial capacity for power, resource extraction, manufacturing space driven primarily by terrestrial demand, but increasingly to support the actual in-space ecosystem and economy. And then space tourism becomes a major industrial activity available to a wide cross-section of the public. So that would be the upper bound. And then finally, let's talk about this leadership piece. The question we ask is, does the U.S. maintain the technological and philosophical lead in the creation of this expanded space? So the lower bound is that no, it doesn't, that many nations, international and transnational commercial interests operate in space, and it's not based on an extension of the fundamental terrestrial tenets of a liberal international order. In other words, free will, free people, thoughts and ideals don't necessarily extend in space. The U.S. coalition is not the space leader in that they are at a serious disadvantage in protecting their interests and capabilities in the civil, commercial, and military realms. So that means somebody else is the leader. That could be our strategic rivals today. As a matter of fact, I'll talk a little bit about China has a very long-term plan for this expanded space. It's very specific, very definite in what they're trying to do, and it's a whole-of-government approach. Autocracies have that ability, I guess. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the rivals that we have today are the rivals that we're going to see in 2060. And it may not even be necessarily a country that's our rival. It could be a transnational or a commercial interest or a consortium of folks. And we talk a little bit about that. The upper bound for this leadership role is that, yes, the U.S. alone or with its allies holds the lead power position in aggregate across the civil, economic, and military realms. So we do provide that leadership. Space is protected as a free domain under a rules-based international order with an established norms of behavior that promote philosophy of open trade, and space is a commons for all humanity. So that's the upper bound. So what do we do with all these things? So this is three different axes, the people, the money, and the leadership, with bookends on either end, the positive and the negative. So that's 2 times 2 times 2 is 8 different futures. And what we did was we defined those 8 futures. That's 8 different scenarios that we can explore and think through what are the implications to national power for each of those 8. So we named all 8 of them. We borrowed the names from science fiction and from history and even some from current events. And you can see them there. So, for example, the case where all 3 of those bookends were positive. Yes, there's going to be expanded people in space, lots of entrepreneurship and new wealth streams found in space. And U.S. and its allies lead all of that. We call that the Star Trek future. That's kind of the one that we want to live for. That's the epitome of everything we hope for. Of course, the converse of that, where all 3 questions are no, we call that dark skies. That's what we want to avoid. But there are 6 other futures in there to look at. And each one has its characteristics and its nuances. And we tried to describe what were the inflection points that got us to those positions, looking from the future backwards. What are the key decisions? What were the things that enabled us to get to those futures, or how did we avoid the bad futures? And let me pause here for a second to say why, as the chief scientist of the Air Force Space Command, we're even doing this. So this is the first step of a 3-step process. The first step is to take the current trends and extrapolation of technology and a little bit of strategic foresight and come up with these scenarios, determine what their value is to national power. But the second step is coming, and that is, what's the strategy to enable the futures that we want? And you can see some of those are positive, some of them are negative, a couple of them are sort of neutral. We want to enable the futures that we want, so we need a strategy. And that's not just a military strategy, that's a combined civil, commercial, and military strategy to enable them and to avoid the ones we don't like. And then finally, the third step of this process, which we haven't got to yet, is to what are the minimum essential capabilities needed to enable that strategy. So what is the technology that you need to get where you want to be? And that's why I'm interested, because that allows us to develop long-term science and technology roadmaps that guide our investment in all of these things. And this is not a new idea. This idea of developing scenarios was really made famous by Shell Oil Company in The Art of the Long View by Peter Schwartz, where you define future scenarios, and then every decision you make in the short term, you weigh them against those future scenarios and say, okay, does this help me get to what I'm trying to do or avoid it? And that's exactly what we're trying to do here. So let's go into some of these in a little more detail. Again, pay attention to the icons. The ones on the top are sort of the positive futures. The ones on the bottom are the negative futures, and then the ones in the middle. So let's first talk about these expansive, the ones on the top, the optimistic and expansive futures. So again, Star Trek is the one where all 3 answers are yes. We have U.S. coalition leadership over space domain, free world laws and norms prevail. They have significant new revenue streams, and thousands of humans live and work in space. The Garden, Earth, and Elysium ones are almost as good, but lack one of the three elements. So, for example, Garden, Earth doesn't have the human presence. It's really characterized by robotic space and autonomy. And the Elysium one, really, we didn't find the new revenue streams that we were looking for, but we still pushed out and did things. And I'm going to read from the report a little bit describing these optimistic and expansive futures. I have copies of the report with me, and I hope you come take a few back, mostly because I don't want to carry them back on the plane, but it's a good read, and you'll get a lot more details. But let me just talk about the military aspects of this optimistic and expansive future. The U.S. coalition is the lead military space power. Other spacefaring nations continue to challenge the lead through expansion of their own capabilities or through alliances with other spacefaring nations. The U.S. coalition has the range of military capabilities necessary to protect the critical elements of their extensive civil, commercial, and human presence across this lunar space from conventional and cyber threats. They also have the ability to protect military power through the cislunar environment, to exercise selected space superiority in time and place as needed for conflicts within space and as part of a larger cross-domain conflict. And finally, they have the capability necessary to preempt any other nation from monopolizing key logistics points. The lunar poles, the Lagrangian points, etc., are key assets, asteroids, lunar water, for military uses. So that's kind of the military aspects. The civilian key points of these optimistic and expansive futures are that the U.S. coalition successfully leads to the established civil norms of behavior, rules of laws for space that support their beliefs and interests. In other words, free and open markets, open access to transit, and all of that. The U.S. coalition promotes and leads in multinational development of critical infrastructure. That includes communication, situational awareness, collision avoidance, etc., while developing independent infrastructure required to ensure national interest during peace and conflict. And finally, there's limited ability to accomplish civil goals unilaterally. Power is distributed among many spacefaring nations with a wide range of space capabilities and interests. Competitors and adversaries pursue alternate civil strategies to limit the U.S. coalition. There's an expanded set of first-tier commercial space powers, for example, China, India, the U.S., European Union, Russia, Japan, Brazil. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. We had a follow-on workshop that really explored what would the players be on the world stage in 2060. So if I have time, I'll come back to it. And finally, from a civil perspective, the U.S. coalition leads in space exploration with international outposts and colonies on the moon and outposts on Mars, asteroid exploitation and interstellar exploration. Other major spacefaring nations and alliances have competing commensurate civil-focused exploration programs. And then finally, the third leg of this, what is the commercial aspects of this optimistic and expansive set of futures? The size of the space economy has expanded greatly, more so in Star Trek and Garden Earth, but substantially in Elysium. Commercial space capabilities provide the preponderance of raw materials and manufactured products to further expand space capabilities. The U.S. coalition is the lead commercial space power and attracts a disproportionate fraction of global space investment. But the preponderance of commercial capabilities is distributed across many nations and entities. The U.S. coalition's leadership is continuously challenged by other first-tier commercial players and by the continued proliferation of space commerce across nations and multinational companies. Multiple nations have moon bases or colonies competing with the U.S. coalition in providing key infrastructure for commercial exploitation of the moon and continued development, manufacturing, and facilities across this lunar space. So again, you can learn a little bit more about the details of each one of these individually. Each one of them would make a great science fiction novel just describing how you got there and what the conditions are. And we did a lot of talk about that. But let me talk about the pessimistic and expansive futures, the more negative ones. So in this case, these are the ones where the U.S. and the coalition is not the leader. Someone else is. And it encompasses the Zheng He, the Wild Frontier, and Z's Dream. So for For Zhang He, it's, yes, we've expanded people in space and money in space, but somebody else is in charge of that. And again, somebody else could be, we gave this a Chinese name, but that's not necessarily who's in charge. It could be somebody that we're not even anticipating right now. It could be a multinational corporation. Wild Frontier, we labeled that not applicable for who's leading, because that's basically nobody's leading. It's just free-for-all. It's the wild, wild west. But finally, the Z's dream is the one where we really haven't defined a new set of wealth generating mechanisms in space, but the people and the leadership have expanded. Unfortunately, it's not U.S. leadership. So let me describe a little bit about the expansive and pessimistic futures. First of all, militarily. The alternate chief space nation and its allies lead in military space power and have the range of military capabilities necessary to defend the critical elements of the commercial, civil, and military and human space assets, as well as the ability to monitor and control space operations and to provide information services in and through and from cislunar environment. They also have the capability to project power across the cislunar domain, full range of conflicts in space. They leverage their commercial and civil leadership to maintain and further lead their military space power. They use their commercial lead to exclude other spacefaring nations from critical locations and resources in space. They use their cost advantage from their space commercial infrastructure to outproduce other nations' space military capabilities. They further their civil and commercial leadership by exerting pressure or by threats of force, and they restrict their unilateral military actions to avoid the development of alliances amongst the nations holding the preponderance of military space power. And the U.S., of course, works to create such military alliances. And finally, the U.S. and other spacefaring nations are forced to create independent infrastructure to ensure national interest during peace and conflict. That's the military. The civil aspects of this future is that the alternate chief space power promotes norms of behaviors and laws for space that serve their self-interest. Where not possible, they exploit the diversity of interest in spacefaring nations to limit the establishment of space norms, rules, and laws that impact their lead position. They lead in developing multinational space civil infrastructure to promote alliances. The U.S. coalition forms alliances to oppose the lead power's actions and have built alternative civil space infrastructure to support the nation's interests. And finally, multiple nations have established bases, colonies on the moon and Mars, and pursued asteroid exploration and interstellar exploration. But the alternate chief space power leads in civil exploration to promote national prestige, further patterns of dependency, and support the technology and infrastructure for commercial and military space leadership. So that's the civil aspects. The commercial aspects are that while the preponderance of commercial power is distributed across a number of nations, with the U.S. coalition having a significant space commercial presence, the alternate chief space power has a large and growing technological and market share advantage over all other spacefaring nations that attracts a disproportionate share of the global commercial space investments. They have a significant advantage in scale and pricing for space structures. They lead in space resource extraction. They have de facto control over key locations in space, for example, Lagrangian points in the moon, polar regions, space elevator, lunar point, key mineral deposits, etc. They use non-competitive practices to maintain and extend their lead position with limited capability by the U.S. coalition or other nations to counter these practices. They limit these actions as required to avoid encouraging alliances and to oppose them. And finally, the U.S. subsidizes U.S. space industries supporting critical national needs where supply by the lead space power or its allies pose unacceptable risk. So clearly those are not the futures that we're looking for. And what is it that we can do to avoid that? So there's two more that we need to talk about briefly, and those are the non-expansive futures. And those are the ones that are kind of important to think about, at least from my perspective. So if you think about this, the two space futures are, okay, we haven't really found new wealth streams in space, and we really haven't expanded people in space much. And the only difference is who leads it, the U.S. or the alternate nation. I would propose or submit to you that this is the situation that we're in today in space. Space Policy Directive 4 that the President signed earlier this year called for the creation of a U.S. Space Force. There's a lot of work going on today to counter the threats that we have in space. There's activity that's going on today that would hold our assets at risk if in a time of a conflict. My boss, General J. Raymond, the 4-star in charge of Air Force Space Command and the newly established U.S. Space Command, worries about these things every day. These are problems that he has, and it's a competitive fight to see who can dominate in space today. The problem is we're not thinking about those other two axes. What about the expanded people in space or the money in space? And from a DoD perspective, putting my Air Force Space Command hat back on, those are important. What does it mean for the future military if we have commerce streams in space? Pick one, asteroid mining. We got trillions or quadrillions or quintillions, some people say, of dollars of resources coming back from asteroids. Who's protecting that? Who's keeping the pirates away from that? Is that a role for the U.S. military? Right now it's not, but should we be thinking about that? I think so. And the same for humans. What if all of these people were living and working in space? Who is in charge of rescuing those in times of trouble? Who are the combat medics that are out there treating those folks when needed and evacuating them to orbit when needed? So these are all things that we need to be considering. Unfortunately, for these non-expansive futures, we're not thinking about them today. We need to think about them more broadly, especially as it relates to military and civil applications of space. So to me, these are a couple of the more telling futures. So the report says, these futures take the lower bound for human presence in space economy, and these futures, human presence is primarily limited to government-supported space exploration and commercially to information services, communications, PNT, between LEO, GEO, and some tourism. So basically what we have today, a little bit more of it. The dominant value of space in these futures is in supporting global military information dominance and is disrupting and denying it to adversaries. These futures are polar cases where either the U.S. or the alternate nation leads. So I won't go through the details of the civil, military, and commercial aspects of these futures, mostly because I hope this isn't what we end up with. And you can read more about that in the report, which I hope you take. So just sort of to wrap this up, some of the conclusions that we came to from our Space Futures workshop. This was after several days of talking through each of these scenarios and these three axes. First of all, we must recognize that in 2060, it's kind of undeniable that space will be a major engine of national political and economic military power for whichever nation best organizes and operates to exploit that potential. So the nation or entity that gets their act together first wins in this race. The U.S. faces growing competition from allies, rivals, and adversaries for leadership in exploration and exploitation of space. No kidding. I already mentioned China is already today executing a long-term strategy to develop the cislunar domain. They have an explicit aim to be the technologically dominant nation in cislunar space by the mid-2030s. So the broad conclusion is a failure to do these things to remain the space power will place the U.S. national power at risk. And so we provided a few recommendations to U.S. leadership. And again, this was a combination of civilian, military, and economic. So we included industry in these recommendations. And that is the U.S. as a whole must develop a long-term national space strategy. It must address how national security establishment will defend the full range of expanded national interest in space, for example, future space commerce. Must develop essential capabilities to enable positive outcomes through policy, regulatory, and economic means. This is clearly not just a technological problem. And we must include investment in science and technology to drive the rapidly changing global space environment. And again, that's why I'm interested in this, is from my position as chief scientist, how do we how do we develop the technology to enable these futures that we want. So again, we published all this in a report, Future of Space 2060 report. You can get it. There's a link there where you can get that. We have a few copies here. I hope you can pick this up. I'd also like to point out that this was not an effort just from my position as Air Force Space Command. We had lots of NASA. We built upon NATO, and NATO had a lot of input into the trends and the interactions. And of course, the Air Force Research Lab, because of their programs and investment in future technology, was very interested in this and helped write this. So I hope you do read it. You have some comments. It's been very well received in the press, and we have these next two steps to take, the strategy development and the essential capabilities. And if you're interested in participating in any of that, please let me know. We'd love to have your thought and participation in these future workshops. Thank you very much.
My understanding of the current situation is there's no appetite to revisit international treaties, to think about revising or abrogating the Outer Space Treaty, and what we're seeing is national space legislation. So Luxembourg's space mining stuff, the U.S. CSLCA from 2015. So how much of those played a role in the sort of projections here? I mean, was there thought given to, might there be a new international regime, or is it going to be, we're just waiting for the first person to violate the Outer Space Treaty when it comes to resources, and we'll see what the heck happens then?
No, that's an excellent question, and we spent quite a bit of time talking about just that topic. In fact, our expert at the Space Futures Workshop on that was Dr. Andrea Harrington from Air University, who's an expert on the Outer Space Treaty in 1958. And her perspective is not what I expected. Her perspective is that the current Outer Space Treaty should be our friend. It's actually quite liberally worded and allows for a lot of activity that is positive in these futures. What we tend to think is restrictive. It talks about militarization and ownership of space bodies, and all of that's true. But there's actually quite a bit that it either explicitly allows or doesn't explicitly talk to, and so it's actually something that we probably haven't fully invested in looking at ways to take advantage of what's in the current Outer Space Treaty. That said, you're correct. There are policies and regulations that could probably help us out, and that's what these other nations like Luxembourg are doing. Is they're very explicitly putting down policies and regulations that promote their position, and I think we should definitely look at those kind of things for sure. But it's largely also about the norms of behavior. So as we push out into this new space, if we're the leaders, we get to set the standards. We get to define what's okay and what isn't. And so that's a big social aspect of this too. So good question. Thanks.
You were describing tasks that are for space defense that are usually attributed to Coast Guard, defending from pirates, talking about rescue in space. Is it time to bring the Coast Guard back to the Air Force?
If you ask me, I think so. I mean, so we had as the new. So this year, some of you may be aware, we stood up a new combatant command in the United States called the United States Space Command. It's currently headquartered in Colorado Springs, actually in the same building where Air Force Space Command is. That is the combatant command that defines the role of the joint military today in space. So for the last 10 years or so, that's been handled by U.S. Strategic Command. There was a Space Command in the early 80s, but when 9/11 happened, we consolidated. So the important point about that is that U.S. Space Command has what's called their Unified Command Plan. This is the set of orders that are signed off by the President nominally every year that says, okay, this is what you, Space Command, do. We had a to me, a very significant addition to that first unified command plan for U.S. Space Command, in that we added that one of the missions of U.S. Space Command is to protect civil or commercial activities in space. So that's significant. That's a step forward. That means if somebody attacks our communication satellite tomorrow, it's the job of U.S. Space Command to go defend that. That's a far bit from having a space Coast Guard or a Space Guard, but I think it's a step in the right direction, and we're making those kind of things. And that hits exactly on the kind of decisions we need to make to enable these space futures. So thanks for that.
Well, first I got to say that when you talked that our main objective was free and open access to space with us, with a technological superior, I just felt very proud. That's a very honorable goal in my opinion. So let's talk about the other guys' goals. You said that China wants to displace us. What is a complete win for them? Is that complete denial? Is that technological access? Is that denial on whenever they want it, but allow us to have access on their terms? I mean, do we have a good enough feel of what we're up against?
Yeah. And I'm not a geopolitician at all, and I don't want to pretend to be one either. But and I also don't want to focus too much on China as our only strategic competitor, because in 40 years it could be significantly different. But the truth is, there are very open plans. The Chinese white papers and their long-term plans are to develop this cislunar space, and they have perfectly good reasons to do that. They have a very rapidly growing economy that they have to maintain. The resources of asteroid mining would be very enticing to them. They have very strong interest in putting colonies on the moon. The lunar rover that landed earlier this year is the first step on that. I think, though, to look at their perspectives, they're trying to overcome this century of humiliation that they've been left behind in terms of technological advance. And so the great book, The 100-Year Marathon, talks about their long-term plans to become dominant and technologically superior in a lot of different areas by the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the PRC in 2045. And the space piece is a big piece of that. But you just have to look to the South China Sea and their exertions of ownership and hegemony in those things to extrapolate that to the moon, to be very worried. But that said, again, they have very established and sensible reasons for doing what they're doing. Other nations are on the rise as well. So the second workshop that we had just last month looked at that very issue. What are the other rising space powers? And we went across the board, looked at UAE, Brazil, Turkey, all sorts of other nations that have space plans, as well as commercial plans. So, it's quite possible, you didn't hear this from me, but the next U.S. boots on the moon may not be a NASA astronaut, it could be a commercial entity. And we need to think about what that means as well. So it's a broad question that we need to think through. Thanks.
I've got a question here.
China demonstrated they could shoot down a satellite and cause a huge mess.
Yep.
And pretty much it says that any country capable of launching a spacecraft into low Earth orbit, even if they're not shooting down other people's satellites but their own, could really block off access to space to everyone. And it doesn't take much technology to do that.
This is true.
But doesn't seem to be any solution to that.
Well, and again, back to the kinds of things that my boss, General Raymond, is worried about. That is definitely one of them. So, there's 4 countries now that have demonstrated the ability to do anti-satellite shoot down in low Earth orbit. That's the U.S., Russia, China and now India is the most recent. And I think the worst thing that we can have is that being this exclusive club that people aspire to be in, to have the capability to do that, because you're right. The consequences can be disastrous and can deny access to space for all of us in the future. So we have to pay attention to this. And again, you got to get back to why is it that these countries are doing this? There's a geopolitical statement or capability that they're trying to posit when they develop an anti-satellite program, and we need to look at the root causes of those. So I totally agree with your statement. We need to worry about those things.
In a world of technological access for all, the only fundamental U.S. advantage in space is that at the present time we have the majority of the commercial industry. That brings with it a unique vulnerability that command economies do not have. Our private industry will only invest in things that the legal system allows them to monetize the investment in.
Mm-hmm.
Command economies do not have to worry about return on investment. We do. And so international norms of behavior that are deleterious to the development of property rights and clear title and investment strategies and paths to political independence, all of which are strong motivations for private action, do not deter command economies' behavior, but they do deter ours. So we're the only ones who have to get this right in our own national policies in order to shape the development of private industries that support our national power. And I'm very concerned that when this has come up in legislative in the past, and there's been legislative proposals to do things about it, the DOD has been at best silent or below the radar, kind of hostile to the development of these things, and I think that's a serious weakness.
Yeah, I hear everything you say, and I agree. I think through this workshop and some of this thinking, we're trying to pull the DoD along in this area. So I agree. Thank you.
Maybe just hand the mic one over, and then we'll bounce over.
I think that stagnation in this research topic mainly comes from lack of authority in working on something impossible technology. But clearly we need the technology of the 23rd century, but the proposers need to write something based on the technology of the 20th century. So the many billionaires are interested in this kind of topic, but they don't want to risk their reputation. So the Elon Musk can, publisher, we try to invest in this technology but the Tesla stock price will fall. But the DARPA can publish a news release without any, risking any reputation. So there's a clearly difference between public, very famous people and the government organization. So how do you address that kind of problem from a strategic standpoint?
Yeah, what you say is true. Part of our goal of this, and again, this is the first step of the three-step process. The next step is to develop the strategy that we're talking about. And I agree that it has to be not just limited to military or commercial or civil space. It needs to be a combination of all three. We need to be pulling in the industrialist as well as the military and the commercial folks to do this. That doesn't mean that it needs to be dictated or edicted, but I think an understanding of the larger consequences of what we do in space is important for each of those three, and so that a combined strategy could be enabled.
Can I see another hand over here? Yeah.
So given that China has now developed a strategic plan, do we have a time frame for when the United States will produce their strategic plan?
Good question. I think the answer is right now, with the space policy directives that have come out of the president, the conversation that's been happening in Congress over the last couple of years, the stand-up of this U.S. Space Command, a lot of these things are in the forefront right now. Space isn't, we're not always the cool kid that's talked about on the news. And it's been a long time since that's been the case. And a lot of it is driven by some of these high-profile space barons doing really cool stuff in space. But the truth of the matter is, right now, today is probably the best time that there has been in many decades to do just what you're describing, come up with a long-term time frame for this. So the hard part about this exponentially increasing rate of change in technology is to predict. If you use linear extrapolation to predict where we're going to be, you're probably not going to get it right. It's very difficult. And if you've ever read Thomas Friedman's Thank You for Being Late, he talks about this increasing rate of change as a function of human society's ability to adapt to the change, and he would argue that we're actually beyond our ability to adapt to rapidly change. And so the time is now to get these plans in place. In a lot of activities going on right now, it just needs to be coordinated and put in the context of these external futures. Well, thank you very much.